The blizzard came howling down from the mountains like a living thing with teeth and claws. And Fiona Lambert knew with absolute certainty that if she did not find shelter within the next hour, she would die out here in this frozen wasteland of white. She had been traveling west with her uncle's wagon train when they were caught in an early winter storm that descended upon the New Mexico territory with a vengeance that no one had predicted. It was October of 1883, and the weather should have still been mild enough for safe passage, but the mountains had other ideas. The wagons had scattered when the wind became so fierce that visibility dropped to nothing, and Fiona had lost sight of the others when her horse bolted in panic. Now she was alone, her fingers numb inside her gloves, her face stinging from the ice crystals that pelted her skin like tiny needles. She urged her horse forward, though the poor animal was struggling through snowdrifts that came up to its knees. Fiona's teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue, tasting blood. Her vision blurred with tears that froze on her eyelashes. She had left St. Louis 3 months ago with such high hopes, planning to join her aunt and uncle who were establishing a ranch near Hillsboro, New Mexico. She was 19 years old, orphaned 2 years prior when cholera took both her parents, and the promise of a new life out west had seemed like a blessing. Now it seemed like the worst decision she had ever made. Through the curtain of snow, she thought she saw something dark against the white. A building, maybe, or just a rock formation. Her heart leaped with desperate hope. She guided her horse toward it, praying she was not hallucinating. As she drew closer, she could make out the distinct shape of a cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly wept. She dismounted clumsily, her legs barely able to hold her weight. She stumbled through the snow to the door and pounded on it with both fists. "Please," she called out, though her voice was weak and raspy. "Please, someone help me." The door opened so suddenly that she nearly fell forward. Strong hands caught her by the shoulders, steadying her. "Good Lord," a male voice said. "Get inside, quick." Fiona found herself being pulled into the warmth of the cabin. The heat hit her like a physical force, and she swayed on her feet. The man who had opened the door shut it firmly behind her, blocking out the howling wind. "You are half frozen," he said. "Come closer to the fire." Through her blurred vision, Fiona could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt and worn trousers, and his hands, when they guided her toward the fireplace, were calloused and strong. He helped her sit down in a chair near the hearth and immediately began removing her snow-covered cloak. "My horse," Fiona managed to say through chattering teeth. "I will see to it in a moment," he replied. "First, we need to get you warm before you lose any fingers or toes to frostbite." He knelt down and began unlacing her boots, which were caked with ice and snow. His movements were efficient but gentle, and Fiona was too exhausted and cold to feel any embarrassment at the intimacy of the gesture. "What in blazes are you doing out in this storm?" he asked as he worked. "No one with any sense would be traveling in this weather." "We did not know," Fiona said. "The storm came so suddenly. We were with a wagon train, we got separated." He glanced up at her, his eyes sharp with concern. "How many others?" 15 wagons. "My aunt and uncle, the Townsends, are leading them. We were heading toward Hillsboro." "Hillsboro is 20 miles south of here," he said. "If your train scattered, they will likely try to circle back together once the storm passes. But that will not be today or tomorrow, by the looks of it." He removed her boots and began massaging her feet through her stockings, trying to restore circulation. "Can you feel this?" "Yes," Fiona said, wincing at the pins and needles sensation. "It hurts." "Good. That means nothing is frozen solid." He stood up and moved to a small trunk in the corner, pulling out a thick wool blanket. He wrapped it around her shoulders. "I am going to get your horse into the lean-to out back. Do not move from that fire." He pulled on a heavy coat and hat, then stepped back out into the storm. Fiona sat shivering under the blanket, holding her hands out toward the flames. The cabin was small but well built, with solid log walls and a sturdy roof. There was a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding various supplies, and not much else. It was clearly the home of a man who lived alone and valued function over comfort. True to his word, the man returned within minutes, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Your horse is settled. Poor creature was about done in. I gave him some feed and water." He shook out his coat and hung it on a peg by the door, then turned to face her properly for the first time. "I am Daniel Kane. This is my winter cabin." "Fiona Lambert," she replied. "Thank you for taking me in. I truly thought I was going to die out there." "You very well might have," Daniel said bluntly. He moved to the stove and poured something from a pot into a tin cup. "Drink this. It is just broth, but it will help warm you from the inside." Fiona accepted the cup gratefully and sipped the hot liquid. It was simple beef broth, probably made from dried meat, but it tasted like heaven. She drank it slowly, feeling warmth gradually spreading through her chest and belly. Daniel watched her for a moment, then seemed satisfied that she was recovering, and turned his attention to stoking the fire. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Fiona asked. Daniel glanced toward the window, though there was nothing to see but white. "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be 3. This is early for a storm this severe, but when the mountains get angry, they do not calm down quickly." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I need to be honest with you, Miss Lambert. My supplies are low. I was planning to head down to Hillsborough myself in a few days to stock up for the winter. I have enough to keep 1 person fed through the cold months, but 2 people will be tighter." Fiona felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "I am sorry for the burden. I will eat as little as possible." "That is not what I meant," Daniel said, his voice gentler. "I am just letting you know the situation so you understand. We will make it work. I am not about to turn you back out into that storm, and I am not about to let you starve. We will just need to be careful and hope this winter is not as brutal as I fear it might be." "What makes you think it will be brutal?" Fiona asked. "The animals," Daniel replied. "I am a trapper by trade, and I have been watching the wildlife for weeks now. The squirrels have been gathering nuts like mad. The deer have grown thick coats earlier than usual. And I found a woolly bear caterpillar last month that was almost completely black. All signs point to a hard winter ahead." Fiona had grown up in the city and knew nothing about reading nature's signs, but something in Daniel's tone told her he knew what he was talking about. She looked around the cabin again, noting the barrels and sacks stored along one wall. She could not tell how much food was there, but it did not look like an abundance. "I have some money," Fiona offered. "When we can get to town, I can purchase supplies. Money is not much use when the snow is 6 feet deep and the nearest town is a day's ride away," Daniel said. "But I appreciate the offer." He moved to the window and peered out again. "This storm is only going to get worse before it gets better. We should probably take inventory of what we have and start planning our rations." Over the next hour, as Fiona continued to thaw by the fire, Daniel went through his supplies. He had flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, and sugar. He had a few cans of preserved vegetables and fruit. He had potatoes stored in a root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the floor. He had traps set in the surrounding woods, though he admitted that checking them in this weather would be impossible for days. "If I can get out to my trap lines once the storm clears, I might be able to bring in some fresh meat," Daniel said. "Rabbit, marten, Maybe beaver if I am lucky. That would help stretch everything else. I can help, Fiona said. I do not know much about living in the wilderness, but I can learn. I can cook and clean and do whatever you need. Daniel looked at her appraisingly. Have you ever skinned an animal? No. Plucked a bird? No. Chopped firewood? No, Fiona admitted, feeling increasingly useless. But I am willing to learn. I'm not afraid of hard work. Something in Daniel's expression softened. I believe you, city girl or not, it takes courage to head west in the first place. We will figure it out together. He glanced toward the window again. Right now, the most important thing is to stay warm and conserve our energy. This cabin is well insulated, but we will need to keep the fire going constantly. Firewood is one thing I do have plenty of, thank the Lord. As evening fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind shrieked around the cabin like a chorus of angry spirits, and snow piled up against the walls in drifts that reached halfway to the windows. Daniel prepared a simple meal of fried salt pork, beans, and cornbread. Fiona ate slowly, trying not to seem greedy even though she was ravenous. The ordeal of being lost in the storm had drained her completely. You can have the bed, Daniel said after they had cleaned up from supper. I will sleep by the fire. I cannot take your bed, Fiona protested. This is your home. And you are my guest, Daniel replied firmly. Besides, I am used to sleeping rough. I have spent many nights curled up in far less comfortable places than a chair by a warm fire. Fiona wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a heavy weight. She nodded gratefully and moved toward the bed. It was a simple affair, a wooden frame with a corn husk mattress and several thick blankets. She removed her outer clothing, hanging her skirt and shirtwaist on a peg to dry properly, and climbed under the blankets in her undergarments. The mattress crackled beneath her, but it was blessedly warm and dry. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Daniel was already settling into the chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Get some rest. Tomorrow we will assess the situation and make a proper plan. Fiona closed her eyes, listening to the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. She should have been terrified, stranded in a tiny cabin with a strange man while a blizzard raged outside, but somehow she felt safe. There was something solid and dependable about Daniel Kane, something that made her believe he would do exactly what he said he would do. She fell asleep thinking about his strong, capable hands, and the way he had looked at her with concern rather than calculation. When she woke, pale gray light was filtering through the windows. The wind was still howling, and snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Daniel was already awake, feeding wood into the stove and preparing coffee. The smell of it filled the cabin, rich and bitter and comforting. Good morning, Daniel said when he noticed she was awake. Storm is still going strong. Looks like we will be spending another day indoors. Fiona sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders for warmth. How deep is the snow? 3 feet at least, and still coming down. Even if we wanted to try to reach Hillsborough, we would not make it half a mile. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one over to her. I checked on your horse. He is fine, sheltered and fed. Thank you. Fiona sipped the coffee gratefully. It was strong enough to strip paint, but the heat and the caffeine were exactly what she needed. What should I do to help today? Can you sew? Daniel asked. Yes, fairly well. Good. I have some clothes that need mending, and I never was much skilled with a needle. That would be useful. He paused, then added, and I could teach you some things. How to maintain a fire properly, how to prepare dried meat, that sort of thing. Skills that will serve you well out here. They fell into an easy routine over the next several days as the storm continued to rage outside. Daniel taught Fiona how to bank a fire so it would burn slowly and steadily through the night, how to make the most of limited ingredients when cooking, and how to tell when meat was properly cured versus beginning to spoil. Fiona mended his shirts and trousers, darned his socks, and even managed to patch a hole in his winter coat using scraps of leather and sinew that he had stored away. As they worked side by side in the close quarters of the cabin, they talked. Fiona learned that Daniel was 26 years old, originally from Missouri. He had come west 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of freedom and the chance to make his own way without answering to anyone. He had tried his hand at prospecting first, spending 2 years in the Colorado mountains before concluding that gold fever was a fool's dream. Trapping suited him better, he said. It was honest work, and it allowed him to spend most of his time in the wilderness, which he preferred to the company of most people. That sounds lonely, Fiona said. Daniel shrugged. I like my own company well enough, and I am not completely isolated. I go into Hillsboro every few weeks during the warmer months to sell my furs and buy supplies. I know folks there. I just do not need to live on top of them. Do you ever think about settling down? Fiona asked. Having a family? Something flickered across Daniel's face, too quick for her to identify. I have thought about it, but this life is not easy for a woman. Most would not want to spend months at a time in a cabin barely bigger than a horse stall, with no neighbors for miles and supplies always running short. Some women might not mind, Fiona said quietly, if they loved the man they were with. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and Fiona felt her cheeks grow warm. She busied herself with the shirt she was mending, keeping her eyes on her stitches. The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. It was Daniel who broke the silence. Your aunt and uncle will be worried sick about you. I know, Fiona said. I hope they made it to safety. I hope everyone did. They likely holed up in Hillsboro when the storm hit, Daniel said. The town is small but sturdy. They will have taken in any travelers who needed shelter. Your family will assume you perished in the storm, though. They will be grieving. The thought made Fiona's chest ache. Her Aunt Martha had always been kind to her, and Uncle George had promised her parents before they died that he would look after Fiona as if she were his own daughter. They must be devastated. As soon as the weather clears enough for travel, I need to get word to them that I am alive. Agreed, Daniel said, though it may be a while yet before that is possible. He was right. The storm continued for 5 full days, dumping snow in quantities that Fiona had never imagined possible. When it finally passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in white and sparkling under a clear blue sky, the drifts were so high that the cabin door would not open. Daniel had to climb out through a window and dig a path to the door from the outside. Fiona stood at the window, watching him work. He moved with the steady, efficient rhythm of someone who had done hard physical labor his entire life. He had stripped down to just his shirt despite the cold, and she could see the muscles in his back and shoulders flexing as he shoveled. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her belly as she watched him. She turned away from the window, pressing her cool hands to her hot cheeks. This was ridiculous. She barely knew this man. Yes, he had saved her life, and yes, he had been nothing but kind and respectful toward her, but that did not mean she should be entertaining romantic notions about him. She was a guest in his home, dependent on his charity. Any feelings beyond gratitude would be inappropriate. But over the following days, as they settled into life after the storm, Fiona found it increasingly difficult to ignore the way her heart seemed to skip a beat whenever Daniel smiled at her, or the way she looked forward to their evening conversations by the fire. Daniel taught her how to set snares for rabbits, and she felt absurdly proud when she successfully caught her first one. He showed her how to skin it, and though the process made her queasy at first, she forced herself to learn. Out here, squeamishness was a luxury no one could afford. Daniel checked his trap lines and brought back 3 rabbits, a marten, and a small beaver. The fresh meat was a welcome addition to their diet, and Daniel set about preparing the beaver tail, which he said was a particular delicacy. Fiona was skeptical until she tasted it, roasted over the fire until the skin was crispy and the meat tender and rich. "You were right," she admitted. "That is delicious." Daniel grinned, and the expression transformed his usually serious face. "I told you. City folk do not know what they are missing." "I suppose I am not so much of a city girl anymore," Fiona said. "I have skinned a rabbit and eaten beaver tail. I think that makes me at least halfway wild." "Halfway," Daniel agreed, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "But you have still got a ways to go before you can call yourself a mountain woman." "What else would I need to do?" Fiona challenged. Daniel considered this. "Well, you would need to learn to shoot, for one thing, and track game, and survive a night out in the open with nothing but what you can carry." "Teach me then," Fiona said impulsively. "Teach me all of it." Daniel's expression grew serious again. "Why?" "You will be back with your family soon enough, living on a nice ranch with a proper house and neighbors and all the comforts of civilization." "Maybe," Fiona said. "Or maybe I will decide I prefer this." "This," Daniel gestured around the small cabin. "Being stuck in a tiny cabin with supplies running lower every day and winter just beginning." "Being self-sufficient," Fiona corrected. "Learning skills that actually matter, living close to the land." She paused, then added more softly, "Being with someone who treats me like I have a brain and can learn things, instead of like I am a delicate flower who needs to be protected from the realities of life." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "I do not know. A helpless city girl who would complain about the accommodations and cry about the hardship, I suppose. But you have not complained once. You have worked hard and learned fast and done everything I have asked of you without hesitation." He shook his head slightly, as if marveling at something. "You are tougher than you look, Fiona Lambert." The way he said her name, with that rough edge to his voice, made Fiona's stomach flutter. "My father used to say that strength is not about how much you can lift, but about how much you can endure without breaking." "Your father was a wise man." "He was," Fiona said softly. "I miss him. I miss both my parents every single day." "I lost my mother when I was 12, Daniel said. "Fever took her. My father followed her 5 years later. Broken heart, the doctor said, though he called it heart failure. I think it is the same thing, really." "I am sorry," Fiona said. "It was a long time ago." Daniel stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "I should check the firewood supply. We are going through it faster with 2 people." Fiona watched him pull on his coat and head outside. She was learning to read him, to recognize when he was pulling back from vulnerability. He was like a half-wild animal in some ways, she thought, capable of gentleness, but always ready to bolt if things got too intense. She wondered what it would take to earn his complete trust, to see him let down his guard entirely. As November turned into December, the cold deepened and more snow fell. Daniel was right about it being a brutal winter. The temperatures dropped so low that even standing near the fire, Fiona could see her breath in the air. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate, and Daniel spent hours each day chopping more, determined to stay ahead of their needs. The food supplies dwindled steadily despite their best efforts to ration carefully. By mid-December, they were down to the last of the flour and beans, and the salt pork was nearly gone. Daniel's trap lines were producing less as the wildlife grew scarce, hunkering down to survive the cold. Some days he came back empty-handed, his face grim with worry. "I am going to have to try to make it to Hillsborough," Daniel said one night as they sat by the fire, sharing a thin stew that was more water than substance. "We cannot last much longer on what we have." "It is too dangerous," Fiona protested. "The snow is too deep and there is another storm coming. I can see it in the clouds." "I know it is dangerous," Daniel said, "but staying here and starving is also dangerous. At least if I try to reach town, there is a chance I can bring back supplies." "Then I am coming with you," Fiona said firmly. "Absolutely not. If something happens to me out there, at least you will still have shelter and what little food remains. If we both go and both perish, there is no second chance." "And if you go alone and do not come back, I will starve here by myself," Fiona countered. "At least if we go together, we face whatever comes as a team." They argued about it late into the night, but Fiona would not budge. Finally, Daniel threw up his hands in frustration. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met." "Good," Fiona said. "You need someone stubborn in your life. Otherwise, you will just brood alone in the wilderness until you turn into a hermit who talks to trees." Despite the tension of the moment, Daniel laughed. It was a real laugh from deep in his chest, and the sound of it made Fiona smile. "I do not talk to trees," he said. "Yet," Fiona replied. "Give it a few more years." The next morning they woke to another snowstorm. This one was not as fierce as the first, but it was steady and relentless. They could not attempt the journey to Hillsborough in these conditions, so they settled in to wait it out. The delay meant their supplies ran even lower. They were down to one small meal a day, and even that was barely enough to take the edge off their hunger. Daniel gave Fiona the larger portions, and when she protested, he insisted he was used to going hungry. "Trappers learn to survive on very little," he said. "I have gone days without eating before. You need to keep your strength up." But Fiona noticed that he was growing thinner, his face becoming more gaunt, and it broke her heart. One night, when he served her the evening meal, she saw that he had given her nearly all the food and kept only a few spoonfuls for himself. She stared at the bowl in her hands, then back up at him. "Daniel Kane, you sit down right now and share this with me properly, or I will not eat a single bite." "Do not be foolish," Daniel said. "You need to eat, so do you." Fiona stood up and thrust the bowl at him. "Half, I mean it. If you do not eat half of this, I will throw the whole thing out the door into the snow." "You would not dare," Daniel said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Fiona walked to the door and reached for the handle. "Try me." All right, all right." Daniel held up his hands in surrender. "We will split it evenly, but you are being unreasonable." "I am being fair," Fiona said. She divided the stew carefully into 2 bowls, making sure each portion was exactly equal. They sat down at the small table and ate in silence. The stew was thin and watery, more of a broth really, but Fiona forced herself to eat slowly, to savor every bite and make it last. When they finished, Daniel looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. "Why did you do that?" "Because we are in this together," Fiona said simply. "You saved my life when you took me in during that storm. The least I can do is make sure you do not starve yourself trying to keep me alive." "It is not about debt," Daniel said quietly. "I am not keeping you alive because I expect something in return." "I know that," Fiona said. "You are doing it because you are a good man. But good men need to eat too, Daniel. You cannot take care of me if you are too weak to stand." Something shifted in his expression. He reached across the table and took her hand, his rough, calloused palm warm against her cold fingers. "When did you get so wise?" "I have always been wise," Fiona said, trying to keep her tone light even though her heart was pounding at the contact. "You just have not been paying attention." Daniel's thumb traced a gentle circle on the back of her hand. "I have been paying attention," he said softly. More than I should, probably. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Daniel pulled his hand back, breaking the contact. He stood up abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the falling snow. Nothing. Forget I said anything. But Fiona was not about to let it go. She stood and crossed to him, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Daniel, look at me. He turned, and in his eyes she saw everything he had been trying to hide. Longing, fear, desire, and a deep, aching tenderness that made her breath catch. I should not feel this way about you, he said, his voice rough. You are young and you have your whole life ahead of you. You deserve better than a trapper who lives in a cabin barely big enough to turn around in and can barely keep you fed through the winter. You let me decide what I deserve, Fiona said. She reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the scratch of several days' worth of beard against her palm. You are a good man, Daniel Kane. A strong, capable, kind man who has done everything in his power to keep me safe and warm and alive. Do you think I have not noticed that? Do you think I have not seen the way you look at me when you think I am not paying attention? Fiona, Daniel breathed her name like a prayer. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face. If we do this, if we let this happen, there is no going back. Your aunt and uncle will expect you to marry a rancher or a merchant, someone with prospects and stability, not a man who lives on the edge of civilization and might starve in a hard winter. I do not care what my aunt and uncle expect, Fiona said fiercely. I care about you. I care about the man who taught me to skin rabbits and set snares and keep a fire going through the night. I care about the man who gives me his food even when he is hungry himself. I care about the man who makes me laugh and treats me like an equal and looks at me like I am the most precious thing in the world. Daniel's control finally broke. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Fiona felt as though she had been struck by lightning. The kiss was desperate and tender all at once, full of all the longing and fear and need that had been building between them for weeks. Fiona wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had, trying to pour all her feelings into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I have loved you for weeks now, and it has been torture trying to pretend otherwise. I love you too, Fiona whispered. I think I started falling for you the moment you pulled me into this cabin and saved my life. Daniel kissed her again, softer this time, a seal and a promise. Then he wrapped his arms around her and held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood like that for a long time, swaying slightly, finding comfort in each other's warmth. We still need to figure out how to survive the rest of this winter, Daniel said eventually. Love does not fill empty bellies. No, but it helps, Fiona said. Everything is easier when you have someone to face it with. The next day, the snow finally stopped. The sky cleared to a brilliant blue, and though the cold was intense, the weather was stable. Daniel made the decision. We have to try for Hillsborough now while we have a window. Another storm could trap us here for weeks, and we will be out of food within days. They prepared carefully, packing what little food remained and bundling themselves in every warm garment they possessed. Daniel loaded his rifle and made sure his powder was dry. We will likely see wolves out there, he said. They get bolder when the weather is this harsh and food is scarce. Stay close to me and do not run no matter what. I understand, Fiona said, though the thought of encountering wolves made her stomach clench with fear. They set out just after dawn, leading Fiona's horse, which would carry their supplies and could provide transportation for Fiona if she grew too tired. The snow was deep, coming up past their knees in places, and the going was slow and exhausting. Daniel broke trail in front, and Fiona followed in his footsteps, trying to step exactly where he had stepped to conserve her energy. By midday, they had covered only a few miles. Daniel called a halt and they rested briefly, sharing a handful of dried beans and some snow melted in their mouths for water. Fiona's legs were trembling with exhaustion, but she did not complain. She could see the strain in Daniel's face and knew he was pushing himself to his limits. "How much farther?" she asked. "Another 15 miles, maybe. We will not make it today. We will need to camp overnight and continue tomorrow." Daniel scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp and alert. "There is a small cave about 5 miles ahead, if I remember correctly. We can shelter there." They pressed on. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when Fiona heard it, a long, eerie howl that seemed to echo across the frozen landscape. She froze, her heart hammering. "Keep moving," Daniel said calmly. "They are still far off." But over the next hour, the howls grew closer. Daniel's jaw tightened and he unslung his rifle, checking to make sure it was ready to fire. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Then Fiona saw them. Gray shapes moving through the trees to their left, shadows that resolved into the lean, hungry forms of wolves. There were 5 of them, possibly more hiding in the forest. Their eyes gleamed in the fading light, and their ribs showed through their fur. They were starving, desperate, and they had found potential prey. "Daniel," Fiona said, her voice shaking, "I see them." Daniel raised his rifle, but he did not fire. Wolves usually avoid humans unless they are desperate. These looked desperate. The wolves began to circle, moving with the eerie coordination of pack hunters. Daniel backed up slowly, putting himself between Fiona and the predators. The horse whinnied nervously, pulling at its lead. One of the wolves darted forward, testing their defenses. Daniel fired, and the sharp crack of the rifle echoed through the forest. The wolf yelped and retreated, bleeding but not fatally wounded. The others snarled but held back, reassessing. "I only have 3 more shots," Daniel said quietly. "We need to reach that cave. When I say run, you run as fast as you can. Do not look back." "I am not leaving you," Fiona said fiercely. "You are going to do exactly what I tell you," Daniel said. There was steel in his voice now, command authority that brooked no argument. "If I fall, you keep going. You get to that cave and you survive. Promise me." "Daniel, promise me." "I promise," Fiona said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. The wolves attacked in a coordinated rush. Daniel fired again, dropping one of them. Then he fired a 3rd time, hitting another. But there were still 3 wolves left, and they were not deterred. Daniel grabbed Fiona's arm and shouted, "Run!" They ran, crashing through the snow, the horse galloping ahead of them. Fiona could hear the wolves behind them, their snarls and the sound of their paws pounding through the snow. Her lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest, but terror gave her strength. Daniel stopped abruptly and turned, putting himself between Fiona and the pursuing wolves. He fired his last shot, hitting the lead wolf square in the chest. It dropped, but the remaining 2 kept coming. Daniel dropped the rifle and pulled his hunting knife, the long blade gleaming in the dying light. "Keep running," he shouted at Fiona. But Fiona had made a promise under duress, and she was not about to honor it. She grabbed a thick branch from the ground, its end jagged and sharp, and swung it at the nearest wolf. The makeshift weapon caught the animal across the snout, and it yelped, momentarily stunned. Daniel grappled with the other wolf, his knife flashing. The animal was strong and vicious, its jaws snapping inches from Daniel's throat. Fiona swung her branch again, this time connecting solidly with the wolf's ribs. The creature yelped and released Daniel, turning its attention to this new threat. Daniel did not waste the opportunity. He lunged forward and buried his knife in the wolf's side, driving it deep. The animal collapsed, twitching. The last remaining wolf, seeing its pack decimated, turned and fled into the forest. Daniel stood there, breathing hard, blood on his hands and coat. "I thought I told you to run," he said. "I promised I would survive," Fiona said. "I never promised I would leave you to die." Daniel stared at her for a moment, then he started to laugh. It was a slightly hysterical sound, born of adrenaline and relief. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "You are going to be the death of me," he said into her hair. "Not today," Fiona replied, her own voice shaking. "Not if I have anything to say about it." They reached the cave as full darkness fell. It was not much more than a shallow indentation in a rocky hillside, but it provided shelter from the wind and a place to build a small fire. Daniel gathered what dry wood he could find, and Fiona managed to coax a flame to life using the techniques he had taught her. They huddled close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, the horse tethered nearby. Daniel cleaned his knife and reloaded his rifle using the precious ammunition he carried. His hands were shaking slightly, the aftermath of the adrenaline wearing off. "That was too close," he said quietly. "I should never have put you in that situation. We should have waited longer, tried to stretch our supplies further." "We would have starved," Fiona said. "You made the right choice." "The right choice would have been to make sure I had enough supplies stored before winter hit," Daniel said bitterly. "The right choice would have been to head to town weeks ago, before the first storm. I got complacent, and it nearly cost you your life." Fiona took his face in both her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Stop. You saved my life. Multiple times now, you took me in when I would have frozen to death. You have shared everything you have with me, even when it meant going hungry yourself. You just fought off a pack of wolves to protect me. You are allowed to forgive yourself for not being perfect." Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion in the firelight. "I could not bear it if something happened to you. Do you understand that? The thought of you being hurt, or worse, it makes me feel like I cannot breathe." "I feel the same way about you," Fiona said softly. "Which is why we are going to be smart and careful and make it to Hillsborough together, both of us, alive." Daniel kissed her then, a fierce, claiming kiss that spoke of fear and love and desperation. When they broke apart, he said, "When we get to Hillsborough, I am going to find a preacher and marry you properly. If you will have me." "Are you asking me or telling me?" Fiona asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "I am asking," Daniel said. He took her hands in his. "Fiona Lambert, will you marry me? Will you take on a life that will be hard and uncertain, with a man who does not have much to offer except his whole heart and a promise to love you and protect you for as long as he lives?" "Yes," Fiona said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever we can find that preacher. I do not need wealth or comfort, Daniel. I just need you." They sealed the promise with another kiss, and then they lay down together by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms for warmth. It was not proper, not by society's standards, but they were far beyond caring about such things. They were two people who loved each other, fighting to survive against terrible odds, and they took comfort where they could find it. The next morning they woke early and continued their journey. The going was still difficult, but the weather held. By mid-afternoon they crested a rise and saw Hillsborough spread out in the valley below, smoke rising from its chimneys. Fiona felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "We made it," she said. "We made it," Daniel agreed. He squeezed her hand. Together, they stumbled into town just before sunset, exhausted and half frozen but alive. The first person they encountered was the sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Hodges, who took one look at them and immediately began organizing help. "Get these two to the boarding house," he ordered. "And someone fetch Dr. Martin. That man is bleeding." "It is not my blood," Daniel said. Wolf attack yesterday. We are both fine, just tired and hungry. Wolf attack? The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. Well, you can tell me all about it once you have had a hot meal and a warm bed. Come on, let's get you inside. The boarding house was a simple but clean establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson. She took one look at Fiona and Daniel and immediately went into action, preparing hot baths and hot food and fresh clothes. Fiona nearly wept with gratitude as she sank into a tub of warm water, feeling the cold and grime of the journey wash away. When she emerged, clean and dressed in borrowed clothes, she found Daniel waiting in the small sitting room. He had also bathed and changed, and despite his gaunt face and tired eyes, he looked better. He smiled when he saw her. There you are. I was beginning to think you had drowned in there. It was very tempting to just stay in that tub forever, Fiona admitted. She sat down beside him on the small sofa. What happens now? Now we eat the dinner that Mrs. Peterson is preparing, and then we sleep for about 12 hours straight, Daniel said. After that, we find your aunt and uncle and let them know you are alive, and we find that preacher I mentioned. In that order? Fiona asked. Definitely in that order. I am not about to ask your uncle for your hand in marriage while I am so tired I can barely see straight. Dinner was a feast by their standards. Roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and dried apple pie. Fiona and Daniel ate slowly, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle large quantities after weeks of near starvation. But even small portions felt like a luxury. Afterward, Mrs. Peterson showed them to their rooms. She had prepared 2 separate rooms, naturally, but she gave Fiona a knowing look when she handed over the keys. Young lady, I have been running this boarding house for 15 years, and I have seen my share of people in love. That man looks at you like you hung the moon. You could do a lot worse. I know, Fiona said softly. I have no intention of doing worse, or better for that matter. He is exactly right for me. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. Then you hold on to him and do not let anyone tell you different. Love like that does not come around often. Fiona slept deeply that night, secure in a real bed with a full stomach and a warm room. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and she could hear activity in the street below. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Daniel already up, talking to a man she did not recognize. Fiona, Daniel said when he saw her, this is Reverend Patterson. He is the minister here in Hillsborough. Pleased to meet you, Miss Lambert, the Reverend said. He was a thin man with kind eyes and graying hair. Daniel has been telling me about your remarkable journey. I must say, it sounds like the Lord was watching over both of you. It certainly felt that way at times, Fiona said. She looked at Daniel questioningly. I asked the Reverend if he would be willing to perform a marriage ceremony, Daniel explained. Once we have located your family and received their blessing, of course. Of course, Fiona echoed, though privately she thought she would marry Daniel with or without her family's blessing. But she understood that Daniel wanted to do things properly, to show respect for her relatives and for social convention. Finding her aunt and uncle proved surprisingly easy. The sheriff knew exactly where they were. The Townsend party had indeed made it to Hillsborough during the first storm and had been sheltering at a small ranch just outside of town. When word reached them that Fiona was alive, they came into town immediately. The reunion was tearful and joyful. Aunt Martha sobbed and held Fiona tightly, refusing to let go for several minutes. Uncle George kept shaking his head and saying, "We thought you were dead. We held a memorial service. We wrote to your cousins back east and told them you had perished." I am sorry for causing you such grief, Fiona said. I tried to find you during the storm, but I got lost. If Daniel had not taken me in, I would have frozen to death. Uncle George turned to Daniel, who stood slightly apart, his hat in his hands. "Then I owe you an enormous debt, Mr. Kane. You saved my niece's life. Any decent person would have done the same," Daniel said. "I was just fortunate to be in the right place at the right time." "Do not let him downplay it," Fiona said. She moved to stand beside Daniel, taking his hand. "He did far more than just give me shelter. He kept me alive through weeks of brutal winter with supplies running dangerously low. He taught me survival skills. He fought off wolves to protect me, and he has asked me to marry him, which I have agreed to do. I am telling you this now because I want your blessing, but I need you to understand that I am going to marry him regardless." Aunt Martha and Uncle George exchanged glances. It was Aunt Martha who spoke first. "Fiona, dear, you have been through a traumatic experience. Are you certain you are thinking clearly? Perhaps you have developed feelings for Mr. Kane because he saved your life, but that does not necessarily mean you should marry him." "I know my own mind," Fiona said firmly. "I love Daniel, not because he saved my life, but because of who he is. He is strong and kind and honest. He treats me as an equal and values my opinions. He makes me laugh and he makes me feel safe. I want to spend my life with him." Uncle George studied Daniel carefully. "What are your prospects, Mr. Kane? How do you intend to support my niece?" "I am a trapper, sir," Daniel said. "I make a modest living selling furs. I own my own land and cabin, though the cabin is admittedly small and simple. I cannot offer Fiona luxury or comfort, but I can promise that she will never want for the essentials, and that I will work every day to provide for her and any children we might have." "Children," Aunt Martha said faintly. "You have thought that far ahead." "Madam, I have thought about spending every day of the rest of my life with your niece," Daniel said. "So yes, I have thought about children and growing old together and building a life that may be simple but will be full of love and partnership." Uncle George was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Fiona, would you step outside with your aunt for a few minutes? I would like to speak with Mr. Kane privately." Fiona hesitated, but Daniel gave her a reassuring nod. She allowed Aunt Martha to lead her out onto the porch of the boarding house. Through the window, she could see Daniel and Uncle George in conversation, but she could not hear what was being said. "Your uncle will not forbid the marriage," Aunt Martha said. "He cannot, really. You are of age and can make your own decisions. But he wants to make sure this young man understands the responsibility he is taking on." "Daniel understands responsibility better than most men," Fiona said. "He nearly starved himself to keep me fed. That is not the action of someone who takes his obligations lightly." Aunt Martha sighed. "You truly love him, do not you?" "With all my heart," Fiona said simply. "Then I suppose I cannot ask for more than that." Aunt Martha reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Fiona's ear, a gesture she had done many times when Fiona was a child. "I just want you to be happy and safe, dear. After everything you have been through, you deserve that." "I will be happy with Daniel," Fiona said. "I am sure of it." When they went back inside, Uncle George was shaking Daniel's hand. "Very well, Mr. Kane. You have my blessing to marry my niece. But I want it understood that if you ever mistreat her or fail to provide for her, you will answer to me." "Understood, sir," Daniel said. "Though I assure you, neither of those things will ever happen." The wedding took place 3 days later, giving Fiona time to rest and recover from the ordeal of their journey, and allowing Daniel to purchase supplies and make arrangements for their return to the cabin. Reverend Patterson performed the ceremony in the small church, with Aunt Martha, Uncle George, and a handful of townspeople in attendance. Fiona wore a simple dress that Aunt Martha had brought with her from St. Louis, pale blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Daniel wore his best clothes, which were not fancy but were clean and neatly pressed. When Reverend Patterson asked him to place the ring on Fiona's finger, Daniel slipped on a simple silver band that he had purchased from the general store. "With this ring, I thee wed," Daniel said, his voice strong and clear. "I promise to love you and honor you and stand by your side through whatever comes, for as long as we both shall live." Fiona felt tears slip down her cheeks as she spoke her own vows. Then Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, and Daniel kissed her tenderly while the small congregation applauded. There was a modest celebration afterward at the boarding house, with cake and coffee and well wishes from the townspeople. Uncle George pulled Daniel aside at one point and pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "Money," Uncle George said bluntly. "Enough to see you through the rest of the winter comfortably, with extra to make some improvements to your cabin come spring. Consider it a wedding gift, or Fiona's inheritance from her parents, or whatever lets you accept it without damaging your pride. I do not care what you call it, but I will not have my niece going hungry because you were too stubborn to accept help." Daniel looked like he wanted to refuse, but then he glanced over at Fiona, who was laughing at something Aunt Martha had said. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. I will use it wisely, I promise you that." "I know you will," Uncle George said. "You are a good man, Daniel Kane. Take care of her." "I will," Daniel said, "with everything I have." They stayed in Hillsborough for another week, allowing Fiona to spend time with her aunt and uncle and giving Daniel a chance to purchase the supplies they would need to make it through the rest of the winter. With the money Uncle George had given them, they were able to buy flour, cornmeal, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, dried fruit, and even some tinned goods. Daniel also purchased additional ammunition for his rifle, new traps to replace the ones that had been damaged, and fabric so Fiona could make new clothes and linens. "This is too much," Fiona said, looking at the pile of supplies. "How will we carry it all?" "I purchased a mule," Daniel said. "He is old and stubborn, but he is strong. He will carry our supplies, and we can use him for hauling wood and water once we are back at the cabin." When it was finally time to leave, Fiona hugged her aunt and uncle tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For taking me in after my parents died, for bringing me west, for understanding about Daniel." "Write to us," Aunt Martha said. "When you can get to town, send letters. Let us know how you are doing." "I will," Fiona promised. "And you must visit us in the spring, once the snow melts and travel is possible again." "We will," Uncle George said. He shook Daniel's hand one last time. "You take care of each other." The journey back to the cabin took 2 days, but it was far easier than the desperate trek to Hillsborough had been. They had plenty of food, the mule carried most of the weight, and the weather was cold but clear. They spent one night camping under the stars, wrapped in warm blankets, talking about their plans for the future. "I want to add a room to the cabin," Daniel said. "Make it bigger, more comfortable. Maybe build a proper barn for the animals. Plant a garden come spring." "I want to learn to hunt," Fiona said. "Really hunt, not just set snares for rabbits. I want to be able to help provide for us, to be a true partner in this life we are building." Daniel kissed the top of her head. "You already are a true partner. But I will teach you to hunt if that is what you want. I will teach you everything I know." When they finally reached the cabin, it looked different to Fiona somehow. Smaller, maybe, and more isolated than she remembered, but it also looked like home. This was the place where she had fallen in love, where she had learned to be strong and capable and self-sufficient. This was where she and Daniel would build their life together. They unloaded the supplies and settled in. With the cabin well stocked, the worst of their worries were over. They could focus on simply living, on enjoying each day and each other's company. Daniel checked his trap lines regularly and brought home furs that they would sell in the spring. Fiona cooked and cleaned and sewed, and Daniel taught her to shoot his rifle, to read animal tracks in the snow, and to move quietly through the forest. The winter was still harsh, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. On cold nights, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, talking about everything and nothing. Daniel told her stories about his years as a prospector, about the mountains of Colorado and the characters he had met. Fiona told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her parents and the bookshop they had owned, about her dreams of adventure that had seemed so impossible when she was a girl living in the city. "You got your adventure," Daniel said, running his fingers through her hair, "though I suspect it was not quite what you had imagined." "No," Fiona agreed. "It was better, harder but better. I found something I was not even looking for." "What is that?" "Purpose," Fiona said, "and love, and a place where I belong." As winter slowly gave way to spring, the snow began to melt and the world came back to life. Streams swelled with runoff, birds returned from their southern migrations, and the first green shoots of new growth appeared on the trees. Daniel and Fiona emerged from their cabin like bears from hibernation, blinking in the bright sunlight. They set about the work of improving their home. Daniel felled trees and began constructing an addition to the cabin, a second room that would serve as a bedroom and give them more space. Fiona helped where she could, and when she was not assisting with the construction, she worked on clearing ground for a garden. She planted seeds that she had purchased in Hillsboro: carrots, potatoes, beans, squash, and herbs. "It feels like we are putting down roots," she said to Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch he had built, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "We are," Daniel said. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "This is our home, Fiona, for as long as we want it to be." "I want it to be forever," Fiona said. "Then forever it is," Daniel replied. In late spring, they made the journey to Hillsboro to sell Daniel's furs and purchase additional supplies. They visited Aunt Martha and Uncle George, who were thrilled to see them looking healthy and happy. Over dinner, Fiona shared news that she had only recently confirmed herself. "I am expecting a baby," she said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "The baby should arrive in the fall, around October." Aunt Martha let out a delighted squeal and immediately began making plans. "You must come stay with us for the birth. You cannot have a baby alone in that cabin, miles from any help." "We will discuss it," Daniel said, though Fiona could see the worry in his eyes. Childbirth was dangerous under the best of circumstances, and the idea of something going wrong when they were isolated in the cabin clearly terrified him. Over the following weeks, they did discuss it extensively. Finally, they reached a compromise. They would stay at the cabin through the summer, but in September, before the baby was due, they would move to Hillsboro temporarily. They would stay with Aunt Martha and Uncle George, or rent a room at the boarding house, until after the baby was born and Fiona had recovered enough to travel safely. The summer was glorious. Fiona's garden flourished, providing them with fresh vegetables that were a welcome change from their winter diet of dried and preserved foods. She also discovered that she had a talent for making cheese from the milk of a goat they had purchased. Daniel built a small chicken coop, and they acquired several hens, which provided eggs and occasional meat. As Fiona's pregnancy advanced, Daniel became increasingly protective. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too hard in the heat. He fussed over her constantly, making sure she drank enough water and rested frequently. It would have been annoying if it were not so clearly born from love and concern. "I am not made of glass," Fiona told him one afternoon when he insisted she sit down after she had been weeding the garden for only 20 minutes. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not going to break. I know that, Daniel said. But you are my wife, and that is my child you are carrying. I am allowed to worry. You are allowed to worry within reason, Fiona corrected. But not to the point where you are hovering over me every minute of every day. I need to stay active and strong, Daniel. That will make the birth easier, not harder, Daniel sighed. I just want you to be safe, both of you. Fiona softened. She stood up from her chair and wrapped her arms around him, resting her head against his chest. I know, and I love you for it. But you need to trust that I know my own body and my own limits. I promise I will not push myself too hard. But I also cannot sit idle for months while you do all the work. They found a balance, as they always did. Daniel learned to step back and let Fiona continue her usual activities while remaining alert for signs that she was overdoing it. Fiona learned to ask for help when she needed it and to rest when her body told her to. In early September, they packed up what they would need for an extended stay in town and made the journey to Hillsborough. Aunt Martha had prepared a room for them in the house she and Uncle George had purchased, a small but comfortable place with whitewashed walls and lace curtains. She immediately took Fiona under her wing, sharing advice about pregnancy and childbirth based on her own experiences. She had lost 3 babies herself, she told Fiona quietly, before successfully carrying a son to term. The son had died of fever at age 7, and she had never been able to conceive again. So you understand why I am so protective of you, Aunt Martha said. You are like a daughter to me, Fiona, and that baby you are carrying is the closest thing I will ever have to a grandchild. You will be the best grandmother any child could ask for, Fiona said, squeezing her aunt's hand. The baby, a boy, was born on October 15th, just as the leaves were turning gold and crimson on the trees. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours, but both Fiona and the baby came through it healthy. When the doctor finally placed the tiny, squalling infant in her arms, Fiona felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. Daniel, who had worn a path in the floorboards with his pacing during the labor, sat down beside the bed and stared at his son with an expression of awe and terror. He is so small, he said. He is perfect, Fiona replied. She looked down at the baby, taking in his shock of dark hair, his red, wrinkled face, and his tiny, perfect fingers. What should we name him? They had discussed names but had not settled on one. Daniel reached out and gently touched the baby's hand, and the infant's fingers immediately curled around his father's much larger finger. David, Daniel said, after my father, if that is all right with you. David Kane, Fiona said, testing the name. I like it. David George Kane, after both our fathers. Aunt Martha, who had been assisting during the birth, wiped tears from her eyes. That is a fine name, a strong name. They stayed in Hillsborough through the winter, giving Fiona time to recover and allowing them to introduce baby David to the community. Daniel took on work around town, doing carpentry and repairs for people, earning money to supplement what they would make from his trapping come spring. He proved to have a talent for building, and several people asked if he would be interested in staying in Hillsborough permanently and setting up as a carpenter. What do you think? Daniel asked Fiona one evening as they sat together, watching David sleep in the cradle that Daniel had built. We could make a good life here in town. You would have neighbors, other women to talk to, the doctor close by if anything went wrong. It would be easier and safer than living out at the cabin. Fiona considered this carefully. There was no denying that town life had its advantages, especially now that they had a child to think about. But she also remembered the peace and freedom of their cabin, the satisfaction of living off the land, the beauty of waking up to nothing but wilderness in every direction. "I think we should go back to the cabin," she said finally. "Not forever necessarily, but for now, while we are young and strong and capable. We can always move to town later when we are older or if we need to for David's education. But right now, I want him to grow up the way we have been living. Connected to the land, learning skills that most people have forgotten, understanding where his food comes from and how hard you have to work to survive. Those are valuable lessons." Daniel smiled. "I was hoping you would say that. I love the cabin. I love our life there. But I did not want to force it on you or on our son if you wanted something different." "I want the life we have built together," Fiona said, "wherever that is." They returned to the cabin in early spring of 1885 when David was 6 months old. The baby was healthy and robust, adapting easily to life in the wilderness. Fiona fashioned a sling that allowed her to carry him on her back while she worked in the garden or gathered water from the stream. Daniel built a larger bed to accommodate all three of them, and on cold nights they slept curled together, David safe and warm between them. Life fell into a new rhythm. They rose with the sun, worked hard throughout the day, and fell into bed exhausted each night. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from meaningful labor. Fiona taught David to walk in the clearing around their cabin, laughing with delight as he toddled unsteadily from her arms to Daniel's. Daniel carved toys for his son, little wooden animals that David clutched tightly and babbled to in his nonsensical baby language. The years passed. Winter of 1885 was mild compared to that first terrible winter when Fiona and Daniel had nearly starved. They had learned from their experience and made sure to stock ample supplies well before the first snow fell. Winter of 1886 was harder, but they were prepared for it. Winter of 1887 brought another child, a daughter they named Dorothy after Fiona's mother. Dorothy was an easier baby than David had been, quieter and more content. David, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his new sister and wanted to help with everything. He fetched clean cloths when she needed changing, sang to her when she cried, and insisted on giving her a good-night kiss every single evening. "He is going to be a good big brother," Daniel said, watching his son gently stroke Dorothy's soft hair. "He gets that from you," Fiona said. "You are a good father, Daniel Kane, better than you give yourself credit for." "I am trying," Daniel said. "That is all any of us can do, I suppose, try our best and hope it is enough." In the spring of 1888, Uncle George fell ill. Word reached them through a passing trapper who stopped at their cabin for a meal and directions. Fiona immediately began preparing to travel to Hillsborough, her heart heavy with worry. Daniel helped her pack supplies for herself and both children, then insisted on accompanying them. "You cannot make that journey alone with 2 small children," he said. "I am coming with you." Uncle George lingered for 3 weeks, long enough for Fiona to say goodbye. He told her he was proud of the woman she had become, proud of the life she had built. "You were right to marry Daniel," he said, his voice weak but clear. "He is a good man. He has taken fine care of you." "The best care," Fiona agreed, tears streaming down her face. Uncle George passed quietly in his sleep one night with Aunt Martha holding his hand. The funeral was well attended, proof of how respected he had been in the community. Afterward, Aunt Martha confessed that she did not know what she would do without him. "Come live with us," Fiona said immediately. "At the cabin. We have room now that Daniel has expanded it, and we would love to have you." Aunt Martha looked shocked. "Fiona, dear, I could not possibly. I am too old to adapt to such a life, and I would just be a burden to you." "You would not be a burden," Fiona insisted. "You would be family. And we could use your help with the children if you are willing." "Please, Aunt Martha, do not stay here alone grieving. Come be with people who love you." After much discussion, Aunt Martha agreed to at least try it. She sold the house in Hillsborough and moved her belongings to the cabin. To everyone's surprise, she adapted remarkably well to the rustic lifestyle. She had a gift for preserving food, for making medicines from wild herbs, and for telling stories that kept David and Dorothy entertained for hours. "I thought I was too old to start over," she confided to Fiona one evening as they sat on the porch shelling peas. "But this is good. Being useful again, being part of a family. Your uncle would be happy to see me here." The cabin grew again to accommodate Aunt Martha, and slowly it transformed from a simple trapper's shelter into a real homestead. Daniel built a proper barn, a smokehouse, and a root cellar. Fiona expanded her garden every year, adding new crops and learning to save seeds for replanting. They acquired more chickens, several pigs, and even a cow. In 1890, another son was born, whom they named Daniel Jr. In 1893, a second daughter arrived, Emily. The cabin was full of life and noise and love, a far cry from the lonely bachelor existence Daniel had once lived. "Do you ever regret it?" Fiona asked Daniel one night after they had finally gotten all 4 children to sleep. "The quiet life you used to have before I stumbled into it." Daniel pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Not for one single second. You gave me everything I did not even know I was missing. A family, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving. I love you, Fiona Kane. I have loved you since that first winter when you refused to let me starve myself to keep you fed. I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "That is good," Fiona said, smiling up at him, "because you are stuck with me now. You, me, 4 children, 1 stubborn aunt, assorted livestock, and this cabin in the middle of nowhere." "Sounds perfect to me," Daniel said, and it was. Through hard winters and hot summers, through sickness and health, through the exhausting work of raising children and maintaining a homestead, Fiona and Daniel built a life together. It was not an easy life, and it was not a comfortable life by the standards of the eastern cities Fiona had left behind. But it was a life filled with love and purpose,